Yep. Now we'll share the screen and we'll. Okay. So I hope you're seeing a tidbit announcement. Um, just a couple of quick tidbits on something we've done before. You remember we spent an awful lot of time on international law, and you remember the uh, International Criminal Court. We talked about them, and their chief prosecutor, who's British, had indicted Putin and Bibi Netanyahu and three Hamas leaders and Israel's top general. And all this has created quite a stir. But Trump just banned him from the United States. Oh, dear. So much for international law and the International Criminal Court. Um, and then just a follow up on Ukraine, we mentioned last week that this rare earth minerals may actually bail out Ukraine in Trump's mind. And so this is the headline: Ukraine may one day be Russian. But also maybe not. Maybe it won't be Russian. So some people are saying it might not be Russian. But he's got in mind a big, beautiful transaction, which is he wants $500 billion worth of Ukraine earth metals. And so if we continue to help Ukraine, at least we don't feel stupid. So uh, that those are the little tidbits I couldn't resist. Um, so water. So Trump ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to release 2 billion gallons from these two lakes. And the bottom line, and we've talked about this before, about the Tulare Basin and how it used to be a huge lake in the past. And it's just going into the Tulare Basin, and maybe it'll get back into the aquifer, but it's not being emptied for any purpose. These reservoirs are for use in the hot summer. So this is a very nice map that shows all the water systems in California. And it's even more complicated than that. But I like this color coding. And you can see all of Trump and the Army Corps of Engineers do is, I think, this kind of purplish line. Um, and David, you've lived down in Fresno, so correct me if I'm wrong. But that's all. The federal part of this is very small. Now, there's a lot of coordination among the federal, the state, and local agencies, and they all, no one ever acts independently except Trump had the Army Corps of Engineers do something they couldn't say no to, which was stupid. Um, so I'll get back into the state and local in just a minute. The other things that you can see on this map are Hetch Hetchy for San Francisco, and then the Contra Costa canal, and that system coming from another aqueduct. And then we get down south and we see the Colorado River coming over here. And also for LA, the Owens River which is if you saw Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, it hinted at the Owens River, and that's a whole another story. And the aqueduct that they built was sabotaged, blown up 13 times by the disgruntled people of the Owens Valley. Yeah, Bob.
Just after the 2 billion gallons was released by the Army Corps of Engineers, a lot of commentary made the statement that none of it gets to Los Angeles anyway. But it was phrased in such a way that it suggested that there's no water from the California aqueduct actually reaching the Los Angeles basin for commercial and residential use. But I think there are those gigantic pipes that you see from the I-5 going up over through the Los Angeles National Forest.
You anticipate my next few slides. So thank you for the segue. The local officials pointed out, hey, you're wasting this. This water is for later agricultural purposes, and it could even cause a danger if we get a lot of water like we did a couple of years ago, and you've already flooded partially the basin. The floods immediately are going to be worse in this coming rainfall. So it could actually do damage, and local officials finally had seen enough, and they prevailed on the Army Corps of Engineers to shut the flow. And this is a well-reasoned op-ed from the Sacramento Bee, and it just laid it all perfectly clear. That it was a dangerous stunt, and they credited the Tulare Farm Bureau for finally speaking up and standing up to power and stopping the ridiculous flow of water. So let's look at the California aqueduct. So as Bob was saying, there is water that comes from the Delta that does go down to Southern California. It absolutely does. And here's the coastal branch of it that goes over to the west. And then there are other branches, and you can see it goes all the way down, and it ultimately communicates with the Colorado river flow. So all these things are linked, and there is cooperation at all levels. And until now, nobody's done anything unilaterally until now. This is another look at it, and you get the idea. When we're getting into the history of California, and so much of it is water-based. And as we learned when we were going through the very basics, this all used to be a huge inland sea. And until the Americans came, the Native Americans lived there in their boats and in the Tule and the reeds. And then Americans came and just drained it for agriculture. And this is kind of what we're left with. I think this might be the section that the Army Corps of Engineers opened up. And you see, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, it stops at Bakersfield. It's a very small part of this whole big system. Here's Hetch Hetchy again. That that broke John Muir's heart. We went to took visitors to the John Muir house the other 2 days ago. And it broke his heart that the Hetch Hetchy, it was Little Yosemite, it was dammed, and San Francisco has been getting good water ever since. This ends up, Bruce, at the back of the Stanford campus. I don't know if you ever spotted it. But that's where it ends up, and then it's piped up to San Francisco.
Hey, John, it actually goes through Crystal Springs Reservoir.
I was going to say that's Crystal Springs, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Crystal Springs Reservoir, the whole thing, which is right on the San Andreas Fault.
Is that, and that's the Paul Gas water temple that you see from?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is related. That's right.
And actually, there's another one in Livermore, a similar kind of structure.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So these are the maps. The Salinas River I'll be talking about when we talk about Junipero Serra. And here you see the Colorado River aqueduct a little bit clearer. And of course, there was the All-American Canal, which in 1906 malfunctioned. So where the canal came off the Colorado River was not engineered properly, and the link broke, and the whole Colorado River flowed into this another ancient basin, creating the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea wasn't there in 1905, but it was in 1906 after this terrible accident that did it waste the water? Well, it's been well used for a while, but now it's an environmental disaster down there. Anyway, we're getting into the weeds here. Let's move on. The Colorado River Basin. So who benefits from the Colorado River? So this is a clearer map of the Colorado River aqueduct, and it does connect with the California aqueduct. But who benefits? The Metropolitan Water District, a humongous water district that covers all the cities of Southern California. And it does get water from the California aqueduct, as Bob pointed out. And it also gets Owens Valley water, think Chinatown. And here's the All-American Canal here. Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. You see the All-American Canal. So it gets, turns out 25% of its water comes from the Colorado, and 55% comes from the California aqueduct, as Bob pointed out. Here is David's map that I give you an even larger context. Here's the Colorado River Basin. Jim, here's the Columbia River and the connection down to Oregon. I didn't realize water forms this little bump here, I guess. And
that's the Snake, John. That's the Snake River.
Okay, and Lewis and Clark came to the end here and portaged across and made it all the way to the coast. And this is the Mississippi. I'll be talking about that a little bit later when we get to the Andrew Jackson section of our today's talk. So letters went right off to Congress, the Secretary of Defense, because he's in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers. The letters from local representatives, hey, you're wasting it. We need it in case we have a dry summer. By the way, how come there was so little coordination? So zero benefit, maybe some groundwater recharge, but zero benefit immediately. So truth in numbers, I asked ChatGPT to calculate what percent of the flow through California was wasted. Very small. And here's the calculation if anybody's interested. You have to go with acre feet, which is the biggest measure. As I said, the Metropolitan Water District gets 25% from the Colorado, but 55% comes from the north and is affected by the politics around the Delta. What about the other 20%? Local supplies, local groundwater, recycled water, and conservation gets counted into this because there's been a surplus from that. So here's the question that Trump really probably wants eventually to get to is how much has the preservation of the Delta smelt affected the water that goes to Southern California? And here's the answer. About 700,000 acre feet of water were allowed to flow out to the ocean, I guess in the last year, to protect the Delta smelt. So it does have an impact, and it's not nothing. So we just got to keep what's legitimate and what's actually impactful in mind. Okay, so that's the end of water.
Well, hang on, John. It's not just the Delta smelt. The reason it's done also is for balance in the bay, because the bay has a flushing effect, but particularly up by Martinez, if it gets too salty, you affect a lot of other things besides just the smelt.
Good point. And sure, if too much goes down south and the estuary stagnates a little, that's not good.
It gets salty, doesn't clean out. It impacts salmon. It impacts a lot of other things. So,
all right, you're right. Thank you.
Yep.
So, any other comments on water? Okay. So the 14th Amendment, we talked about that a while back. Bob, is your hand up again?
Yes.
Okay.
Before the 14th Amendment, I just did a quick calculation of the 2 billion gallons that was released. And I looked up the volume of one of the dams, one of the reservoirs. And my quick calculation seemed to indicate that about 2% of the volume of water in the reservoirs was released, which is still not nothing, but it won't be a total disaster, probably.
Yeah. And some of that water may get back in recharge the underground. So
regardless, it was completely performative and nothing else.
Yes, it was. Performative is the word.
And John, you might remember you recommended to us that television show about the water in Central California that had Billy Bob Thornton in it. What was that called?
Goliath.
That's you brought that up before about water resources and the legal issues in California. It's worth seeing.
Yeah, and then there's the Fresno writer Arax who wrote what's the book?
Stripland.
Yeah, Dreamland. Yeah, and it's all about how the aquifer is being pumped dry. And that's what all these water districts, by the way, are negotiating. And it's taken a long time to get a political consensus. But yeah, so Goliath, I think it's season 3. And there's about 6 episodes. It's not all about water. It's a very gripping drama. Billy Bob Thornton has a really close friend who falls into a sinkhole because of the pumping of the aquifer. So that's the emotional hook that draws him to the valley to find out who's pumping the water illegally. Just like in Chinatown, Jack Nicholson tries to find out who's pumping water at night. So the drama around. So those of you who aren't familiar with the California water system, there are a couple of engaging works of fiction that'll introduce you. So this is really a part of California history, and I don't apologize for bringing it and redoing it. As much as complicated it is, it's important that we review it and keep the issues straight. The other thing that's not part of California, well, in a way, it is part of California because I'll explain that in just a second. But we talked about the 14th Amendment and the challenge to birthright just because you're born in California. And that's what the conservatives are challenging. And I'm just going to focus on this one example. My God, there are so many issues, and I wasn't going to deal with it, but I picked up the paper this morning, and holy cow, the first 5 pages are nothing but this craziness. So I thought at least we'd talked about the 14th Amendment, and I'm sorry to postpone continuing with Junipero Serra. Let's just look at the 14th Amendment and the history of that so we can understand. And there is a California hook. So the 14th Amendment, 1868, to overcome the Dred Scott decision, which said that black people were not Americans. Well, let's clear that up. Anybody born in America, including slaves, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States. And here's a word that keeps repeating: jurisdiction, jurisdiction. And this is what the Trumpers are hanging their hat on, this one word. And here's where California does come in. Even in the vitriol of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was a case that came to the legal system. And it was a Chinese named Wong Kim Ark. And he had gone to China for a visit. He'd been born in the United States to legal Chinese immigrants at the time in the 1850s. But then in comes this Exclusion Act in 1882. And 13 years later, he tries to come back into the country, and he's saying, they say, you can't come in because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he says, well, wait a second. I was born here. And this went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said no act of Congress could overrule a constitutional amendment. And certainly no executive order, like Trump promulgated, could overcome a constitutional amendment. So this was brought to the court in California. And they decided 6-2 in his favor. He had the support of the whole Chinese community and other sympathetic people. And the Constitution trumped the Chinese Exclusion Act. It speaks in universal terms and does not make any distinction based on race. By the way, there's a couple of Berkeley rep plays, but Jim, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. First, there's quite an article in the New York Times about all this recently for those who have the New York Times. Also, the Dred Scott Act not only said that blacks were not citizens. It really said that blacks were not people. It held that they were property of whites. The slaves were. So it's interesting history.
Yeah, yeah. And so the 14th Amendment was supposed to settle that. So there's a Berkeley rep play, The Far Country, that deals with all this, and it's just wonderful. If you ever have a chance to see The Far Country, check it out. This was of particular interest to us because a lot of it takes place on Angel Island, where Aiko's mother came through on the way back to from Japan. And it's epic. 2 countries, 3 generations, highly praised. But there's another play called Jaja's African Hair Braiding. And if you ever have a chance to see that, by all means, see it. And it's got an immigrant angle, a very poignant one. But it's quite light and entertaining until, the last half hour. I won't spoil it. So Jaja's African Hair Braiding. And these are all immigrants that work in this salon, the hairdressers. They're all immigrants from West Africa in Harlem, working in Harlem. So it gives you a chance to see the East Coast immigrant stories. So anyway, Trump's executive order was stopped. And at first, on the temporary basis, it was the attorneys general from, I think, 20 states, but 4 of them stepped up. This is the attorney general from Washington, the state of Washington, and he was the lead argument. The judge was very sympathetic to their case, the state's case. Boggles the mind. This judge was appointed by Reagan, right? So you're not talking about a left-wing judge. This seems to be a slam dunk. But it was a temporary stay, but now it's permanent until the Supreme Court decides it. It's almost certain to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's not just one judge that stopped it. There's a second and a third judge that have blocked Trump's order. So what are the Trump lawyers saying? They're saying that the immigrants have to be here permanently. They can't be here on a temporary visa like Kamala Harris's mother and father were here on student visas. And so if Trump's order had been in effect, Kamala would not be a citizen. And there's currently 3 million people living legally, but not on a permanent basis. but with visas in the United States. And if Trump refuses to issue documents to their children, and what would those documents be? A passport or a social security number? Then they're going to be lost. So what he's saying, Trump is saying, that the 14th Amendment has never been universal because there's been a couple of exceptions. And he's right. The jurisdiction word has excluded foreign diplomats who are not felt to be under the jurisdiction. And for a period of time, Native Americans were also not considered to live under the jurisdiction of the United States laws, but that was straightened up in 1924, 100 years ago. But now Trump lawyers are saying, well, jurisdiction actually means allegiance. That's a legal stretch, and everybody sees that as a reversed engineered fraud. And I think that's what the Supreme Court will decide, and that this is just performative. By the way, there's quite a few old world European countries that do not extend citizenship to everyone born in the country. We have Danish friends who had children in Denmark, and they did not receive Danish citizenship. But most of New World countries do recognize a birthright. And it's necessary when you're dealing with immigrants. So there would be a huge practical problem, though, if, say, the Supreme Court unusually supported it. That would mean that every birth would have to be verified by papers saying that the parents were indeed permanent residents of the United States or citizens. And what a headache that would be for local governments. So every birth, instead of simply issuing a birth certificate, you'd have to do background checks on the parents. That's crazy. So that's a practical problem. And the other thing is that this temporary visas, in many cases, have stretched out for decades. So that would affect quite a few people, 3 million living in this country, disproportionately from India and China, because there's a federal cap on the number of green cards issued, only so many for each country. And so if this were accepted and all these temporary residents who are in fact here permanently, they'd be second-class residents, and their kids would be children without a home. So Trump's argument is, hey, the Constitution doesn't recognize windfall, and they're talking about people who circumvent and get into the country temporarily while they're pregnant and have these anchor babies, and that's their real target. J.D. Vance has doubled down on this and said these people are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Why should we let them come in? This word is the crux of the argument, but it's silly. Everybody in this country is under the jurisdiction of, say, traffic laws. If you're fined, it's so easy to say, no, these people are under the jurisdiction of law. And that's what the Supreme Court acknowledged in 1898. And so the real issue is the United States has the ability to integrate new immigrants, and I think there's many of us in class today where that's true. It's certainly true for our family. And other countries don't have that, especially East Asia. China and Japan are notoriously poor for assimilating immigrants. And it's, you could argue, one of the reasons we're a superpower. And there's this wonderful line in Hamilton. He sings a duet with Lafayette. And of course, Hamilton himself is an immigrant born in the Caribbean, and Lafayette's an immigrant born in France. And I'll just let you read how satisfying this song is for Lin-Manuel Miranda. Yeah, so it's part of demonstrations. And by the way, the great grandson of the plaintiff, he joined the American Army and served in World War II. And it was really necessary to have Chinese because Japan had occupied. There's a doctor at our hospital when I came as a resident who was Chinese and Chinese American, and he worked for the forerunner of the CIA and was flown in over the Burma Hump and parachuted into Western China to infiltrate and help the Chinese organize against the Japanese occupation around Chengdu. What if, and this headline just grabbed me, Trump is being slow to follow a judge's order? What? And this was a couple of articles. And then you get this tweet, whatever it's called, that J.D. Vance claiming that judges don't have the power to interfere so much. And so here he is trolling our legal system. And a lot of people say, well, Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court. There was actually an incident where Jackson did ignore the Supreme Court, who said that the state of Georgia had no right to push out the Cherokee. And Jackson's response was, well, John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. But it actually was the federal government that had the responsibility to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling and make Georgia do it, just like federal marshals went in and integrated the schools in Little Rock. But so it's not something Jackson did. It's something Jackson refused to do. He refused to intervene. And that's a little bit different than everybody saying, well, Jackson set a precedent. Maybe it's splitting hairs, but that's the way the legal system works. And of course, these are the Cherokees starting out on the Trail of Tears. A lot of them died on the road to Oklahoma. So I can connect Andrew Jackson to the Spanish era, and I'll do that later in California. Some of you have been with us for a while know it's maybe a little bit annoying, but I like to see connections in history. It just helps solidify things in my mind. And this was the show. I don't know if any of you remember James Burke, but I'm coming back to Jackson. So Chief Justice John Roberts, seeing all this, and he's expressed concern. And he says all these remarks about ignoring federal court rulings, it's disturbing. And clearly he was responding to J.D. Vance. And so the Supreme Court has an annual report, and without naming names, he emphasized the importance of respecting judicial decisions and avoiding constitutional crises. And here's Trump with Andrew Jackson right behind his desk. When Roberts went further, he said anybody that would be willing to defy the rulings of the federal courts, this is a dangerous suggestion that must be roundly rejected. Heather Cox Richardson put all this together. And then a flashback to 2017. Yeah, Homer.
Well, I've heard that Jackson's statement about Madison that let him enforce it is apocryphal. He never said that. Is it solidly established as an historical fact that he said that? Now let the Supreme Court.
Well, I think the actions speak louder than words, and he never backed up his own Supreme Court. I think that's the issue.
Yes, but did he actually say, now let him enforce it, or how many troops does he have? Those are quotes I've heard attributed to him, and I had believed it, but then heard recently from a right-wing commentator that that's apocryphal. He never said those words.
Okay.
He did take no action, though. You're right.
Yeah, that's the key. That's the key. I'm not sure what he actually said.
Okay, thank you.
But he didn't do. And this is a flashback to 2017. Trump was fighting with the courts on his previous immigration ban, and he said the courts were disgraceful. And Neil Gorsuch said publicly, comments like that are demoralizing and disheartening. So that might be another vote with Roberts on the Supreme Court. I think Amy Coney Barrett would be a vote with Roberts. Who knows? So that, along with the three liberal justices, would stop it. But you'd hope it would be 9-0. Okay. So for those of you that are here for Junipero Serra, I apologize. I just couldn't not say anything about what's burning up the newspapers, the front section. So we're to the Spanish era, unless anybody else has something they want to say about current day stuff, anything they want to ventilate. Okay, so Junipero Serra, we're midway through the review of his biography. We looked at the new laws in California and how we have to teach Junipero Serra. We looked at the contending camps. Is he an occupier or a founding father? That's a pretty big jump. Is he an exploiter of Native Americans or a saint? And what were the influences of his on him and his environment and on him personally? And we went through his early life. We took him all the way to the age of 36, where he gave up a cushy teaching position on a beautiful island of Mallorca. because he had the calling to save souls. And I believe it was genuine. And he and a good buddy, they went to America. And when you go to America to save souls, there was a college in Mexico City of like-minded monks that were there to save souls, and a lot of them were Mallorcans, and they'd been there for over 100 years, Mallorcans. So he and his buddy, also from Mallorca, start walking. And who's his buddy? Francisco Palau. And those of us who love San Francisco, he was the first priest at Mission Dolores. You'll see that Sarah never has much to do with Mission Dolores, because that's really San Francisco was really populated by the De Anza party, not anything that Junipero Serra did, although he talked to De Anza. They'd communicated. But San Francisco is a totally different bag of what we're going to be talking about with Junipero Serra. Palau is his historian, Sarah's biographer, 10 years younger. So he when Junipero Serra's gone and Palau gives him last rites, he writes the biography, and he is an intellect in his own right, more an intellect than Sarah was, at least in writing. So Sarah and Palau, they get to Mexico City, and they get their marching orders, go to Sierra Gorda, and they spend 9 years there. And then they're called back to Mexico City to work for the Inquisition. And Sarah spends another 9 years trying to root out sex and sin and witchcraft and diablitos, little devils. He uses this word a lot in Mexico City. So there's 18 years before he's gets to California. He saves souls, but in Sierra Gorda. And what changes? Well, Charles III is the Spanish monarch, and when he comes to the throne, there's been 150 years of Spanish decline. So nothing has happened since Vizcano was in Monterey and San Diego in 1602. Nothing's happened. And so this is more details on Charles III. We're going fast, so I'm not going to stop. But he was a king of the Enlightenment, but he was not so enlightened that he divided power. He was an absolutist, but he tried to be enlightened, kind of a contradiction. But he was worried about Russians. They were in Alaska. They had enlisted the Aleutians to help them collect furs. That's what that was their profit. It wasn't gold; it was furs, and the furs captured a lot of money in China, a lot of money. And so Charles III says, hey, if the Russians are coming down, we've claimed Upper California. We're going to launch a three-pronged attack. We're going to build presidios to fight any Russians that come down. We're going to establish missions to save the souls of the natives there. And then we're going to put them to work on land grants and build a viable economy in towns and ranchos. And so he commissioned an expedition. But the first thing was the Jesuits were already in Baja California. The Charles III said, "Oh, the Jesuits, they belong to an international order that answers to the Vatican. They're not sufficiently nationalistic enough to settle Upper California for Spain." So, and here's the Aleutians and working with the Russians. And we studied a little bit about their culture when we did Greenland. But actually, it would be a while before the British got to the West Coast, 1791, before they got to Vancouver. And this is Vancouver, Captain George. And then the Russians, they came to San Francisco briefly for a visit in 1806. This is Count Rozanov. He came down from Sitka to see if he could do a trade deal with the Spanish for food. They were sitting up there in Sitka living on fish. And they were looking for grain. And so he came down and he fell in love with the daughter of the commandant at the Presidio. His name was Arguello, and there's an Arguello Avenue right at the foot of Parnassus Hill, where Homer and I got our medical education, Arguello. And he had a daughter, Conchita, and the story was that Rozanov and Conchita fell in love, but they couldn't get married because he was Orthodox and she was Catholic. And so he had to go to Rome to get the Pope's blessing. And I'm going to tell that story, but I'm going to stop now because we got too much to do today. But that story's coming. Great love story. So the Russians did come down. They built Fort Ross. Hey, and we got the Russian River, which we say it rolls off our tongue absent-mindedly, but it was named the Russian River for a reason. So who was in charge? And it was this guy. He was a nobleman, but his family was impoverished, and he worked his way up and became a lawyer and became in charge of the legal system overlooking all of Spanish possessions in the New World. Well, he was given, and they carved out a special designation, translates to inspector, that he came with powers even exceeding the viceroy to get Alta California firmly in the control of Spain. And the context was interesting. This all came at the end of the 7 Years' War, and the British had won, captured Havana and Manila, and Spain was on the losing side. But oddly, Spain is going to gain. Now look at the map before the 7 Years' War. And here you can see they have Florida as well, and the Gulf of America now. And after the war, they've got a land strip all the way to Florida in all this territory and the Spanish holdings. And this was the environment that Junipero Serra was given the keys to the missions of Upper California. So
So, John, if you go back to that map, sorry. In Cuba, even though the British took Havana, Cuba was settled as Spanish in the treaty?
I think that they controlled or blockaded Havana.
But this is after the war. This is the post-war settlement?
Yes.
So maybe
Spain still controls Cuba, but the British had put their mark on it, and in the negotiation, it was a strange negotiation, but what Britain got was leverage to get the French out. And I don't have all the details, but that was the big win, was getting the French, and somehow the Spanish stood in for the French. They took control of New Orleans, so the French were solidly in control of the Louisiana Purchase, but somehow they were in collaboration with the Spanish. And you'll see when you go to New Orleans, there's a French architectural style, and then there's a Spanish architectural style that comes in. So I'm not sure of all the intricacies. I can't explain it.
And note that it's the Gulf of Spain.
You're right.
And in addition to the Pacific Ocean, we have the Greater Equinox Ocean, and further north, the Great Boreal Ocean.
Good eye. Good eye. What did they call Oregon, Jim?
New California, of course. No, disputed territory, which was accurate.
Yeah, disputed territory. Yeah, and I think we talked about this at one point. The movie, The First Cow, showing the very mixed settlement along the coast of Oregon. I think it's after Lewis and Clark. And the British have a very strong presence there. But First Cow is a very interesting movie about this time and what was going on in Oregon. So I think this is a good place to stop. But I want to tease you a little bit so you'll come back next week. Next week, I'm going to make a connection between this Spanish occupation along the Mississippi, and they occupied both sides of the Mississippi at Natchez, and Andrew Jackson, who at the age of 24 arrives here. This is a little bit later, 20 years later, the 1890s. He arrives here, and circumstances lead to charges of bigamy, which don't come out in the 1790s. It takes to the election of 1828 for the charges of bigamy to come out, and it has to do with Jackson's elopement and honeymoon in Spanish Natchez. Next week. Any questions?
Good work, John. Wow.
Excellent.
John, I did hear there's a move to rename the Great Lakes. I think one of them is called Not Your Lake. Another is called So You Think It's Your Lake? and it goes on from there.
Okay. Well, until next week, my friends.
Thanks, John.
The deal, John.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Really well done.
Thank you.
There you go, John. Oh.